Imagine for a moment that you are the most powerful person in the world. You control vast armies, govern millions of people, and hold the fate of an entire empire in your hands. Every decision you make could mean life or death for thousands. The weight of responsibility is crushing, and the stress seems unbearable. Now imagine that despite all this pressure, you manage to find inner peace and develop a philosophy that helps you cope with anxiety and stress so effectively that it continues to help people 2,000 years later. This is not a fantasy. This was the reality of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 CE. But Marcus wasn't just any ruler. He was a philosopher-emperor who, while leading one of history's greatest empires, developed and practiced a system of thinking that modern psychology now recognizes as remarkably effective for managing anxiety and stress. What makes Marcus Aurelius truly extraordinary is not just that he was powerful, but that he was vulnerable enough to write down his most private thoughts and struggles. In his personal journal, which we now know as Meditations, he didn't present himself as an invincible leader, but as a human being grappling with the same fears, worries, and anxieties that plague us all today. He wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about dealing with difficult people, about the uncertainty of the future, and about the challenge of maintaining emotional balance when everything around him seemed chaotic. The fascinating thing is that Marcus Aurelius was facing what he himself described as a multitude of troubles. He was dealing with plagues that devastated his empire, constant military campaigns on dangerous frontiers, political conspiracies, family tragedies, and the enormous burden of governing millions of people across 3 continents. Yet, through his Stoic philosophy, he developed practical techniques that allowed him to not just survive these challenges, but to thrive and maintain his emotional equilibrium. What's even more remarkable is that modern psychological research has validated many of the techniques that Marcus Aurelius practiced nearly 2 millennia ago. Scientists studying cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and stress management have discovered that the methods this ancient emperor used in his daily life are incredibly similar to the most effective therapeutic approaches we use today. The emperor's personal strategies for managing anxiety weren't just philosophical abstractions. They were practical, tested tools that worked in the real world under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Today, we're going to explore how Marcus Aurelius transformed his understanding of anxiety and stress from sources of suffering into opportunities for growth and wisdom. We'll discover how his philosophy can help you distinguish between what you can and cannot control, how to find peace in the present moment when your mind is racing with worries about the future, and how to develop the kind of inner resilience that remains unshakable even when everything around you feels uncertain and overwhelming. This isn't just ancient history. This is a practical guide for modern living, tested by one of history's most stressed individuals and validated by contemporary science. But before we dive into Marcus Aurelius's solutions, we need to understand what he was actually fighting against. Because the truth is, anxiety and stress in ancient Rome weren't fundamentally different from what we experience today. They just wore different clothes. When Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't speaking from a place of theoretical knowledge. He was writing from the trenches of psychological warfare that anyone living with anxiety would immediately recognize. His private journals reveal a man who struggled with racing thoughts, catastrophic thinking, and the overwhelming sensation of being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. Picture this. Marcus would wake up in his tent on the Germanic frontier, knowing that thousands of soldiers were depending on his decisions, that barbarian tribes were planning attacks, that political enemies back in Rome were plotting against him, and that a devastating plague was sweeping through his empire, killing millions of his subjects. His mind would immediately begin spinning with questions. What if I make the wrong military decision? What if the plague reaches my family? What if I'm not strong enough to handle all of this? What if I fail everyone who's counting on me? Does this sound familiar? That cascade of what-if thoughts, that feeling of being overwhelmed by responsibilities and possibilities you can't control, that sense that your mind is your own worst enemy. Marcus Aurelius experienced all of this. But here's what makes his approach so revolutionary. Instead of trying to eliminate these thoughts or pretend they didn't exist, he developed a systematic way of working with them. Modern neuroscience has shown us that anxiety is essentially our brain's alarm system gone haywire. When we're anxious, our amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive, flooding our system with stress hormones and making us hypersensitive to potential threats. This was just as true for a Roman emperor as it is for someone today worrying about job security, relationships, or global uncertainty. The biological mechanisms are identical. What Marcus Aurelius discovered through his Stoic practice was something that cognitive behavioral therapists now call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. He learned to step back and observe his anxious thoughts rather than being consumed by them. In his meditations, he writes, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil." Notice what he's doing here. He's not denying that difficult situations exist, but he's preparing his mind to respond rather than react. This preparation wasn't pessimism. It was what psychologists now call stress inoculation. By mentally rehearsing challenges before they occurred, Marcus was training his mind to remain calm and rational when faced with actual difficulties. He was essentially doing what modern anxiety treatment programs teach, acknowledging that difficult emotions and situations are part of life, but recognizing that our response to them is within our control. The emperor understood something profound that we're only now rediscovering through scientific research. Anxiety isn't the enemy. Our relationship with anxiety is what determines whether it destroys us or strengthens us. Marcus Aurelius didn't eliminate stress from his life. That would have been impossible given his circumstances. Instead, he transformed his relationship with stress, turning it from a source of suffering into a tool for growth and wisdom. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't based on wishful thinking or positive affirmations. It was built on practical daily exercises that retrained his mind to respond to challenges with clarity rather than panic, with acceptance rather than resistance, and with wisdom rather than worry. So what exactly were these daily exercises that transformed one of history's most powerful men from an anxious ruler into a beacon of philosophical strength? The beauty of Marcus Aurelius's approach lies not in its complexity, but in its elegant simplicity. These weren't esoteric rituals requiring years of study. They were practical mental tools that anyone could learn and apply immediately. Let's start with what Marcus called the discipline of perception. Perhaps the most powerful anxiety-fighting technique ever developed. When faced with a stressful situation, our natural tendency is to catastrophize, to imagine the worst possible outcomes and treat them as inevitable realities. Marcus trained himself to do the opposite. In his meditations, he writes, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself." Here's how this works in practice. Instead of allowing his mind to spiral into what-if scenarios, Marcus would force himself to describe situations using only objective, factual language. Rather than thinking, this barbarian invasion could destroy everything I've worked for, he would reframe it as, armed groups are moving across our borders. This requires a military response. Notice the difference? The second description removes the emotional charge and focuses on actionable reality rather than imagined catastrophe. Modern psychologists call this technique cognitive diffusion, the practice of separating thoughts from facts. When we're anxious, we tend to treat our worried thoughts as accurate predictions of the future. Marcus Aurelius understood that thoughts are just mental events, no more real than clouds passing across the sky. He would literally talk to his anxious thoughts, saying things like, I notice I'm having the thought that this situation is unbearable, rather than this situation is unbearable. The second tool in Marcus's arsenal was what he called the view from above. When overwhelmed by immediate pressures, he would mentally zoom out and place his current struggles in the context of cosmic time and space. He writes, remember that in a little while, you and everyone you know will be dead. And soon after that, even your name will be forgotten. This wasn't morbid pessimism. It was liberation through perspective. This practice works because anxiety thrives on the illusion that our current problems are uniquely important and permanent. By regularly contemplating the vastness of time and space, Marcus trained his mind to see temporary setbacks as exactly that, temporary. The presentation that's making you nervous, the conflict with your colleague, the financial worry that's keeping you awake, all of these will pass, just as countless similar challenges have passed for billions of people throughout history. But perhaps Marcus's most practical tool was his morning and evening reflection practice. Each morning, he would spend time mentally preparing for the day's challenges, not by worrying about them, but by reminding himself of his core principles and values. He would ask himself, what is within my control today? How can I respond to difficulties with virtue rather than emotion? What would wisdom look like in the situations I'm likely to face? In the evening, he would review the day without judgment, examining moments when he had reacted with anxiety or anger, and considering how he might respond differently in the future. This wasn't self-criticism. It was what modern psychology calls reflective practice, the systematic examination of our responses to build better mental habits over time. What makes these practices so effective is that they work with the grain of human psychology rather than against it. Marcus understood that we can't simply will ourselves to stop being anxious, but we can train our attention to focus on what's helpful rather than what's harmful. We can't control our initial emotional reactions, but we can absolutely control what we do with those reactions once they arise. The emperor's approach was essentially a form of mental cross-training. Just as athletes build physical resilience through regular exercise, Marcus built psychological resilience through daily practice with these mental tools. And just like physical fitness, the benefits compound over time. Each day of practice makes the next challenge a little easier to handle with grace and wisdom. But knowing about these tools and actually implementing them in the heat of real-world stress are two very different things. The question becomes, how do we take these ancient practices and make them work in our modern lives, with our modern challenges?